Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our somewhat oddly configured room for our plenary, where our speaker is going to be here, and some of you are over there. So if anyone wants to migrate in this direction, please feel free to do so. So I'm Ethan Schrum. I'm a member of the conference committee for this year's S-USIH Conference. And before we get started here, I wanted to just recognize our wonderful committee chair, Jennifer Burns. I wonder if we could all give her a round of applause for her great work. So a tremendous job of getting Stanford ready for our invasion here. So a year and a half ago, when our committee first met, I mentioned that the conference would be held in the thick of the presidential election season. And perhaps we should have a plenary related to that. Now, little did we know what kind of election it would be. But Jennifer immediately recommended David Greenberg, and now here he is live and in person with us. He's a professor of history and also of journalism and media studies at Rutgers, where he's been since 2004. The History News Network named him a top young historian in 2006, and he's written several books, first of which was called Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, in 2003, which won a couple of awards, the Washington Monthly Political Book Award and the American Journalism Historians Association Book Award. Subsequently, he published a book on presidential doodles and a book on Calvin Coolidge. And now his latest and greatest work is called Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency, which has come out within the past year, very nicely timed for the election cycle. And it examines the history of the White House spin machine from the progressive era to the present day, the debates that Americans have waged over its implications for democracy. And I'm teaching Republic of Spin in my U.S. History Survey course this semester, and learning all sorts of wonderful things about, how the allegedly hidebound Calvin Coolidge was in fact a media pioneer and other such nuggets. So Professor Greenberg has a great platform for speaking on this issue of presidential spin to us today. He's also continues to be a practicing contributor to a number of national publications, Slate, The New Yorker, New York Times, and so forth. One technical note, having to do to some degree with our odd setup here, for questions after the talk, for those who are on this side of the room, you can simply ask your questions by voice. For those who are on that side of the room, and hence farther away and harder for Professor Greenberg to hear, we'd ask that you migrate to the microphone that is set up over there. Now, please welcome David Greenberg.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you, Jennifer, and everyone at the leadership of the Society for U.S. Intellectual History for giving me this honor and opportunity to speak, and thank you all for coming. I see a lot of historians in the room who I admire very much and whose comments afterwards I'm sure I will wish I had heard before I finished the book, but be that as it may, I look forward to the discussion. As you know, when you have a new book out, you get to talk about it a lot when it's released, and I've been talking a lot about Republic of Spin in the last few months, which for some reason people seem to think might have some relevancy to things that are going on. And I usually give a kind of overview of the book for general readers, after which I receive about a zillion questions about Donald Trump, who is, as several reviewers pointed out, rather annoyingly, not actually a character in the book. It sort of finished too early for that. And at some point when these questions would come in, I took to answering, well, we still don't know how this movie ends. Because, what I would say about Trump in March might be very different from what I would say in July and today. Although we still don't know how it ends, but I think we're starting to get perhaps a glimpse of the fiery conflagration at the end of the film. Right. Who knows? There's still one more reel to come, though. So, and in general, I'm pretty dubious about using history to explain fast-moving current events. So, I'm not going to offer any, authoritative conclusions about the Trump phenomenon today. But I do have a few thoughts about the campaign that I'll come back to at the end of the talk. Now, Republic of Spin is largely a narrative with mostly implicit argument. It's not meant to be a standard monograph. And that word to me has always evoked protractors and colored pencils. It's not the kind of book I'm inclined to write. This is more something like some of the books that inspired me, Daniel Boorstin's The Americans, or even David Halberstam's books, The 50s, books that weave together many portraits, miniature portraits and vignettes to convey, a kind of broader, even panoramic history of a larger development. In my case, that's the rise of this vast apparatus of tools and techniques that presidents and politicians have used to shape their images, their messages, and our thinking. In other words, spin. So the narrative of the book braids together three basic strands. One strand recounts the presidents themselves who fashioned this machinery of spin, from Theodore Roosevelt and his bully pulpit to Barack Obama and his first ever White House videographer and Twitter feed. Collectively, their shared commitment to using mass media to mobilize public opinion on behalf of a policy agenda, something that by and large 19th century presidents did not share, I think redefined the executive office, making it into what political scientists sometimes call the public presidency. Now, a second strand of the book recovers, in many cases, the forgotten histories of all kinds of behind-the-scenes aides, the speechwriters, press secretaries, campaign consultants, media gurus, handlers, pollsters, hucksters, hacks, flacks, and other assorted spinmeisters who, to this day, ensure that each presidential pose and utterance is shown in the best achievable light. Interacting with one another across the generations and across administrations, these innovators, I argue, embodied a new professional type that came to dominate politics in the 20th century. Experts in information, trained in journalism, media, advertising, social science, related fields, traffickers in words, images, and symbols that are the currency of modern democratic politics. Third, and I think especially important today, the book is also an intellectual history. Republic of Spin recounts the evolving and clashing ideas of the journalists, writers, and critics, from the sociologist Edward Ross in the early 1900s to the satirist Stephen Colbert in the early 2000s, who observed and dissected spin as it developed. Some of these people were boosters who celebrated advances in spin, believing that new tools of image and message craft would help fulfill democracy's promise. John Dewey, for example, celebrated radio for its potential to restore a kind of town hall democracy in an age of mass media. Others, like Vance Packard or Joe McGinnis, were critics, warning that these new practices were corrupting democracy by manipulating the public. And still others, who in a way I consider, although I don't quite say this in the book, the kind of silent heroes of the book, from Walter Lippmann in the 1920s to the political scientist Lindsay Rogers in the 1940s to the philosopher Hannah Arendt in the 1960s to the linguist George Lakoff in the 2000s, might be called realists. They accepted the reality of spin, but tried to demystify it for the public, hoping to improve democracy by educating citizens about how political words and images and messages work. Together, all of these figures and their ideas constituted a vast rolling argument about spin and what it means for democracy. Now, in the book, I draw a number of conclusions from this kind of overstuffed narrative, and far more points than I can set forth today. But one key point I do want to talk about today is that from the get-go, the emergence of professionalized spin in the White House and in national politics more generally has been accompanied by a fierce debate about its meaning for democracy, including a profound worry that the newly powerful president and the newly ubiquitous mass media would fatally corrupt American politics. This anxiety about presidential spin in a democracy, whether it was called propaganda, publicity, news management, image making, or spin, or any number of other things, has been, I submit, an abiding American intellectual tradition. In every period since the progressive era, Americans witnessed advances in White House spin, in the rise of press agents or the use of speechwriters, in the development of radio or the advent of polling, the refinement of persuasion strategies or the arrival of TV or any other step. And in each period they heard warnings that these advances would somehow render the public weak or powerless even to resist their leaders' manipulations. So today, as I recount what will be an extremely condensed account of Republic of Spin, and I'm still trying to persuade my publisher to let me release the director's cut, I want to stress that as important as the transformations in our structures of government and media have been the evolving attitudes that Americans have harbored toward these changes. Widespread concerns about spin surfaced as early as Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, which is where I basically begin my story. To be clear, I don't argue that spin, broadly defined, began with TR. And there are a couple of reviewers who should be aware of that. Spin is inherent in politics, and the book traces it back all the way to the ancient Greeks' attitudes toward rhetoric, which was their version of spin. Plato, some of you will recall from freshman year, deplored all rhetoric, which he considered a fraudulent, debased form of philosophy, likely to delude an excitable public. Philosophy, as he saw it, used reason in the pursuit of truth. Rhetoric relied on emotion and sophistry to induce in listeners mere conviction, not necessarily true belief. In contrast, Plato's student Aristotle considered rhetoric a neutral instrument to be used for good or for ill. Because Aristotle believed in the people's capacity for deliberation, he allowed a place in public debate for emotion, which he thought wards off indifference and encourages engagement. Aristotle criticized not the use of rhetoric, but its abuse, its employment for improper ends. Now, since those ancient times, some form of spin has always been employed by political leaders. Monarchs, dictators, and Democrats alike have artfully tended their statements and images. This includes our own 19th century presidents, as anyone familiar with, say, William Henry Harrison's log cabin and hard cider campaign will know. But I think the presidency did change fundamentally in the early 20th century, and I begin my story there because more than any predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt sought to make the presidency a seat of activism. He used his office to tackle the social and economic inequalities wrought by the Industrial Revolution and mass society. TR developed a whole arsenal of tools and techniques, of institutions and practices to build public support for his reform agenda. He toured widely, delivered policy speeches, convened informal press conferences, staged publicity stunts, hired the first ever press aides, played for the headlines, and otherwise sought to command public attention. Roosevelt, in this way, launched an age of publicity, as it was called in his time, in which presidents and other politicians showcased their activities as a way to promote themselves and their goals. He achieved reforms like federal meat inspection laws and railroad rate regulation, in part through this public presidency. And from the start, critics raged about his successes with the media. One leading detractor was the one-eyed racist demagogue Pitchfork Ben Tillman. On January 17, 1906, at noon, Tillman strode to the Senate floor, where before a packed gallery, he delivered a 2.5-hour tirade against Roosevelt, interrupted only by colleagues beseeching him to temper his remarks. The burden of Tillman's fulminations was that TR was a creation of the media, a self-promoter who came to fame by fabricating his achievements and his image. Quote, he had press agents with the Rough Riders down at Guantanamo, Tillman sneered, charging that, quote again, the newspapers have made him what he is. It is through the great instrumentality represented in that press gallery that he has become puffed to such a degree. Now, at bottom, I think Tillman was frustrated by a structural change in American politics, the eclipse of Congress by the presidency as sort of the main driver of legislation, which Tillman feared would eventually lead to tyranny. And people like Glenn Beck still say these things today about the too-strong presidency. Tillman compared TR to Andrew Jackson and Napoleon. And in fact, Andrew Jackson was one of Theodore Roosevelt's models. But the more proximate cause of Tillman's outburst was TR's retention of, quote, and these are Tillman's words, a trusted friend at $10,000 a year to misinform the public about the administration of Panama Canal affairs. What had happened was Roosevelt had named Joseph Buckland Bishop, a friendly journalist, to handle his Panama Canal project, making him, in essence, the first ever dedicated government public relations officer. That appointment sparked a furor from Tillman and many others over the administration's use of information specialists, with congressional hearings spilling over into a full-fledged Donnybrook about whether government press officers were paid propagandists, as Tillman would have it, or, as Bishop insisted, mere conduits of factual information. Quote, Bishop said to Congress, quote, I give out the situation as it is. And the contours of this debate would reappear under pretty much every president afterward. Presidents since Roosevelt built the spin machine into a formidable instrument. Woodrow Wilson convened press conferences open to all reporters. He cannily delivered his State of the Union messages in person to Congress, a departure from the written letters sent by presidents since John Adams. Warren Harding hired the first presidential speechwriter and staged photo ops in the Rose Garden. Calvin Coolidge mastered radio and consulted with his era's public relations wizards, Bruce Barton and Edward Bernays. Even Herbert Hoover, though remembered as ham-handed with his public outreach, was in his day hailed as a PR genius whose ascent to the presidency, as Walter Lippmann wrote, quote, was planned with great care and assisted throughout by a high-powered propaganda of the latest model. Now, in the 1920s, the growth of propaganda and PR and advertising in both the commercial sphere and in government magnified these qualms that we heard a generation earlier about being manipulated, especially, all the more so, as disillusionment with World War I set in. When the war fought to end all wars and to make the world safe for democracy did neither one of those things, Americans got buyer's remorse. They glommed onto crude conspiracy theories to explain away their former belligerency. They searched for scapegoats. Among those they alighted on were the propagandists. George Creel, a progressive muckraker whom Wilson had named to handle official wartime information, was caricatured as a frothing jingo who made America so war-mad that civil liberties were trampled and the peace was lost. In truth, during the war, Creel was lambasted for being pacifistic and, quote, giving comfort to the enemy because he refused to inject more anti-German bigotry into his materials. Ironically, one of the worst defamers of Creel and most zealous revisionist of World War I was George Sylvester Viereck, who during the war had been an agent for the Kaiser, during the 20s was rehabilitated and published an anti-propaganda tract with an introduction from Colonel House, Wilson's advisor, and then in the 1930s went to work as a shill for Hitler. Meanwhile, the propaganda backlash crippled the thinking of American intellectuals. Many of them were too disillusioned with the World War to see the coming war with proper clarity. One of the few who did was Archibald MacLeish, the poet, playwright, and librarian of Congress, whom FDR named to run the Office of Facts and Figures, the next war's counterpart to the Creel Committee. Against the taunts of Edmund Wilson and Dwight MacDonald and others who accused him of currying favor with FDR, MacLeish maintained that the rise of Hitler and Stalin posed a grave threat to art, free thought, and the values that underpin them, and that artists and writers had a particular duty to defend these values. MacLeish's anti-fascist radio plays, The Fall of the City and Air Raid in 1937 and 38, the latter of which was inspired by the Germans' destruction of the Basque city of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War, warned of bourgeois flaccidity in the face of a hostile invader. Then MacLeish, in a pair of 1940 speeches, one published in The Nation, one in the New Republic, argued that anti-war novelists, including his friends Hemingway and Dos Passos, had, unintentionally, fostered a debilitating disbelief in, quote, all statements of principle and conviction, all declarations of moral purpose. And this debility was now, quote, disarming democracy in the face of fascism, one generation later. Now, once MacLeish took over at the Office of Facts and Figures in 1941, and then when he served in its successor body, the Office of War Information, which replaced the OFF fairly quickly, he championed what he called a strategy of truth. Some other administration officials, such as Fiorello LaGuardia, called for, quote, sugar-coated, colored, ornamented matter, otherwise known as bunk. They were happy to go to any lengths to get the proper message across to Americans. Others demanded something like an American Goebbels. And FDR even flirted with bringing back George Creel, although he was soon disabused of that idea. But MacLeish held that unadorned, truthful information could, of its own persuasive force, enlighten and arouse the public. The strategy of truth, he explained, is the strategy which opposes to the frauds and deceits by which our enemies have confused and conquered other people, the simple and clarifying truths by which a nation such as ours must guide itself. Now, over time, MacLeish and his bureaus did in fact veer into some of the heavy-handed exhortation for which Creel had also been faulted. One series of strident radio shows egregiously lionized FDR as a latter-day Lincoln and prompted Republicans to try to cut OWI's funding. Despite MacLeish's good intentions, the axiom held. Throughout history, spinners have invariably claimed to be truth-tellers who were simply dispelling falsehoods, and those aiming to dispel falsehoods have seldom resisted the temptation to spin. Still, MacLeish grasped the moral stakes in the European conflict when much of the left did not. He helped his country to see that government communication on a massive scale need not be a danger. To be sure, right-wingers like those at H.L. Mencken's American Mercury attacked the expanding federal communications apparatus under FDR as an ominous development, much the way liberals like Walter Lippmann and Bruce Bliven had done in the 1920s under Coolidge and Hoover. But many more Americans regarded FDR's spin as benign, with his fireside chats and even relying on pollsters for messaging help. The president masterfully assuaged anxieties about depression and war and built support for far-sighted policies like Lend-Lease. His press conferences were bravura performances that won the affection of the press corps. During his tenure, the public largely conquered or put aside what the communication scholars Paul Lazarsfeld and Robert Merton called propaganditis, the debilitating fear of persuasion, that at times seemed more insidious than propaganda itself. As Lewis Mumford explained in the same vein as McLeish, quote, analysts of propaganda exposing the rhetorical devices of persuasion themselves put over one of the biggest propaganda frauds of our time, namely the conviction that the important part of a statement is not its truth or falsity, but the question of whether someone wants you to believe it. Now, if the unity that FDR fostered during wartime kept fears of spin in check, they returned full force in the 1950s. The advent of television, along with newly sophisticated methods of advertising and PR, rekindled concerns about slick manipulators of the public mind. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, with the assistance of the Madison Avenue wizard Rosser Reeves, ran the first 30-second campaign spots, which were in fact mind-numbingly dull ads featuring drab people off the street asking stock questions and Ike awkwardly mouthing stock answers. But Democrats became unaccountably apoplectic, accusing the GOP of undermining Enlightenment rationality. George Ball, then an aide to Stevenson, to Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee, sputtered that Ike had hired, quote, the high-powered hucksters of Madison Avenue to sell an inadequate ticket to the American people in precisely the way they sell soap, ammoniated toothpaste, hair tonic, or bubble gum. Stevenson, he promised, would counter sham with truth. And when Ike won and brought his salesman buddies into the White House, the uneasiness swelled. The new leaden-tongued president, lacking any hint of charisma or sex appeal, hired the first ever White House TV coach, the film and television actor Robert Montgomery, perhaps best known today for his bewitching daughter, Elizabeth. Montgomery replaced Ike's glasses with lucite frames. He dressed him in light blue suits. He raised his lectern so the Klieg lights would no longer reflect off his glossy pate. Democrats again deplored the use of this alleged Svengali, even though, to name but one of many precedents, Harry Truman had used Leonard Reinsch as a radio coach in 1948, helping to perfect his supposedly spontaneous speaking style at the 1948 Democratic Convention. Presumably ignorant of this history or oblivious to his double standard, Stevenson, who not coincidentally was himself completely inept with television, continued to rail that, quote, the idea that you can merchandise candidates for high office like breakfast cereal is the ultimate indignity to the democratic process. Nightmares about mass manipulation multiplied. After the Korean War, during and after the Korean War, stories of brainwashing flooded the press, even though social scientists would soon dismiss the phenomenon as basically a myth. Fretful liberals fussed over the Republicans' proficiency with television, as if the public would be hoodwinked into buying the wrong policies. Many social critics synthesized all of these arguments into a grand critique of democratic decay. Aldous Huxley brooded in Brave New World Revisited that today, in the world's most powerful democracy, the methods now being used to merchandise the political candidate as though he were a deodorant positively guarantee the electorate against ever hearing the truth about anything. Quite a strong statement. And in the decade's classic statement of propaganditis, the hidden persuaders, the journalist Vance Packard wrote of the so-called motivation research that advertisers were deploying to get consumers to buy dress shirts and cake mixes that they didn't really need. But Packard's proto-Gladwellian bestseller also assailed how the symbol manipulators that he unmasked were infiltrating politics, quote, to engineer our consent to their projects or to engineer our enthusiasm for their candidates. Already, Packard warned, they had made spectacular strides, this is also a quote, in changing the traditional characteristics of American political life. The Republicans in particular, he said, more than the Democrats, took advantage of, another quote, millions of people in a will-less, helpless state, unable to resist any suggestion offered. Or so he quoted, and that was a quote from John Steinbeck, a well-known Stevenson supporter, but not hitherto recognized as an authority on social psychology. These cutting-edge consultants, Packard continued, had manufactured, quote, a new breed of American politician, epitomized by no less than Richard M. Nixon. Now, social scientists and advertising professionals swiftly dismantled Packard's dystopian prophecies, as they had the stories about brainwashing, even as his book rocketed to bestsellerdom. At the same time, other mid-century social scientists like Merton and Lazarsfeld and Hadley Cantrill, who had been one of FDR's pollsters, were debunking the idea that citizens were easily controlled sheep. They demonstrated, as much social science is again showing today, that people receive political messages not as blank slates, but as thinking beings with preconceptions, loyalties, attachment, capacity to resist. They showed that we're wise to spin, and we can treat official claims with raised eyebrows. Quote, propaganda on its own cannot force its way into unwilling minds, explained Eric Hoffer, author of The True Believer. Quote, neither can it inculcate something wholly new, nor can it keep people persuaded once they have ceased to believe. Where opinion is not coerced, people can be made to believe only in what they already, quote, know. That's from Hoffer. So by the 1950s, I hope it's clear by now, presidential image making, spin, was a widely discussed phenomenon. One thing the book, I think, tries to establish is it did not begin, as is often supposed, with Ronald Reagan or John F. Kennedy or even with television. But increasingly, in the 1950s and afterward, it was a subject of inquiry and analysis, not just by Vance Packard and Eric Hoffer, but by a host of other journalists and intellectuals, ranging from Daniel Boorstin to Marshall McLuhan to Hannah Arendt. And of all of them, I think Arendt perhaps comes closest to transcending the tiresome debates about the supposed menace of artifice in politics. Though she was certainly no apologist for power, and she took up the question of lying and deceit in politics out of anger at Lyndon Johnson for his deceptions about the Vietnam War, she nonetheless resisted Packard's middle-brow moralizing. A theorist of totalitarianism, she knew that there was likely greater peril in having the government purport to set down the definitive truth than in tolerating misleading claims or even lies in public discourse. In fact, she thought democratic politics required such toleration. Quote, no one has ever doubted, she quipped, that truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other. Society needed realms, certainly, devoted to what she called truth-telling. These were, quote, the solicitude of the philosopher, the isolation of the scientist and the artist, the impartiality of the historian and the judge, so we're all included in there, the independence of the fact finder, the witness, the reporter. But politics specifically was not one of these realms. Politics could never be fenced in by preemptive claims about authoritative truth. As another realist about spin, Walter Lippmann, put it, quote, in real life there is not, as there is in every jigsaw puzzle, one picture and one picture only, into which all the pieces will eventually fit. It is the totalitarian mind that thinks there is one and only one picture. If Arendt showed an uncommon toleration and even appreciation of spin, a more popular author at the same time, Joe McGinnis, doggedly retailed the Platonic view of spin's malignance. In his expose of the 1968 Nixon campaign, The Selling of the President, McGinnis purported to disclose the newly insidious influence on politics of professional consultants, with their cavalier regard for the truth and their high-tech methods for duping the populace. The book appeared in 1969, the year of the founding of the AAPC, the American Association of Political Consultants, the trade association for spin doctors, with a cover image featuring Nixon's shadowy mug on a pack of cigarettes. The Selling of the President argued that candidates were now being flogged like consumer products, forgetting perhaps that Adlai Stevenson had said the exact same thing, and that a half-century earlier, no less a spinmeister than Theodore Roosevelt had grumbled about Mark Hanna, saying, quote, he has advertised McKinley as if he were patent medicine. Read today, McGinnis's book comes off as a breathless recapitulation of the obvious, an overwrought tell-all of things everybody knows. But the book did spur political journalists to write more about the image meisters who crafted their candidates' words and appearances. Quote, all of a sudden, everybody said, oh, I get it, they're trying to sell candidates the way they sell soap, recalled Ted Koppel, then a campaign reporter for ABC. From that moment on, Koppel said, we emerged from the Garden of Eden. Now, just as crucial in feeding this new journalistic jadedness, to be sure, was the distress, the dismay, the anger over presidential duplicity resulting from Vietnam, Watergate, and in general, the anti-authoritarian tenor of the 1960s. And in fact, it was the Kennedy presidency, usually misremembered as a time of simple, cozy White House press relations, that saw fissures open that would, under Johnson and Nixon, widen into the storied credibility gap. Still, the distrust of authority throughout the 60s and into the 70s commingled alchemically with the rising power of the professional consultants, like Joe Napolitan, David Garth, Stuart Spencer, and Roger Ailes, who was the breakout star of Joe McGinnis's book. And the result was a pervasive fear of a kind of soulless packaged candidate, programmed by the pollsters, scripted by the speechwriters, groomed by the media gurus to foist onto an unwitting public a Hollywood facsimile of a statesman instead of the real thing. Now, film and fiction had long conjured this specter of an evil Svengali puppeteering a useful idiot to power, from Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here to Eugene Burdick's The Ninth Wave. But this dark fantasy, I think, reached its fullest pop culture expression in The Candidate, the 1972 Robert Redford film, written by former Eugene McCarthy aide Jeremy Larner. Redford played a governor's earnest son, recruited by an unscrupulous consultant to run what's expected to be a doomed campaign. Caught up in the race, Redford's character makes a series of progressively more opportunistic compromises, from beginning to style his hair to ducking questions about dicey issues like abortion. But then, in an 11th hour debate, he erupts in a spontaneous burst of honesty and scores a major upset. Only at the film's end does Redford's character realize he had no ambitions for office, turning to his handler in the last scene to ask, what do we do now? In Sinclair's Lewis 1930s dystopia, the packaging of candidates threatened to empower Huey Long-like dictators. In 1950s scenarios like Burdick's, it was McCarthyite demagogues. Now, in the 70s, the danger was a telegenic cipher, unready to lead a troubled nation. By the 1970s, the public's frustration with imagecraft, layered on top of its disillusionment with official lies, summoned forth a vogue for what we've come to call authenticity. This promiscuously wielded but naggingly imprecise term stands in for any number of personal traits that we might like in a candidate, being personable or down to earth or forthright, or ideologically consistent, or given to spontaneity, or funny, or comfortable on the political stage, or even being self-conscious about the conventions of politics and willing to make fun of them. Now, this taste for authenticity wasn't exactly new in the 70s either. We can see it in Americans' love of the ebullient TR, or the plain-spoken Coolidge, or the unpretentious Truman, or the quick-witted Kennedy, even though we should remember all of these men put great care into seeming natural. But the watershed year for authenticity may well have been 1976, when Jimmy Carter leveraged his own Cracker Barrel humility all the way to the White House. Carter presented himself as a simple peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. He wore cardigan sweaters like Mr. Rogers, and he pledged never to lie to the American people, a seductive promise in Watergate's wake. But Carter, too, soon ran into the headwinds of skeptical journalism. The press discovered his dependence on his wunderkind pollster, Pat Caddell, and the cagey Atlanta ad man, Gerald Rafshoon, who soon bequeathed to the political lexicon the eponym Rafshoonery, another synonym for spin. Carter was duly reclassed as, quote, a media phenomenon who had slyly fudged his credentials. His peanut farming, for example, turned out to be a lucrative agribusiness that merely warehoused and shelled other farmers' nuts. Rafshoonery became a leitmotif of the Carter coverage. A May 1977 New York Times Magazine cover depicted Carter operating a television studio console featuring multiple images of himself, the master image maker. Now, in time, Carter's difficulties, even his ineptitude in both foreign and domestic policy, rendered his image-making hollow. The cartoonist Gary Trudeau sketched a Doonesbury storyline in which a desperate Carter sought help from a secretary of symbolism named Dwayne Delacourt, billed in the cartoon as, quote, the man behind the cardigan, the chat, the stroll, and the public education of Amy. In one strip, Delacourt announces, quote, a major symbolic gesture will take place at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. NBC will, of course, be providing live coverage of the gesture. Looking at Carter's coverage, it's not a stretch to surmise that if he hadn't been such a failure as president, he would be described today as a great communicator in roughly the way people still talk about Ronald Reagan. Since Carter, voters have put a premium on authenticity, whatever exactly they mean by it in any given year. In 2008, both John McCain and Barack Obama styled themselves as avatars of authenticity, anti-politicians who stood high above the shabby business of poll-tested focus group sound bites. McCain, a self-styled maverick, rode a bus he called the Straight Talk Express, dispensed blunt and funny remarks, and was christened the anti-candidate by the novelist David Foster Wallace. Obama, meanwhile, went on Larry King Live to pledge, quote, less spin and more straight talk. But this air of authenticity was, as always, contrived. Both men retained, and both men still retain, legions of strategists and spin doctors devoted to shaping their messages. Theirs was the spin of no spin. Complicating things further, 2 years later, Obama suffered his famous shellacking in the midterm elections of 2010, losing 64 seats in the House and control of the chamber. The Platonist gave way to his inner Aristotelian. Obama chalked up his troubles to bad spin. Quote, given how much stuff was coming at us, he said, we probably spent more time trying to get the policy right than trying to get the politics right. And I think anybody who's occupied this office has to remember that you can't be neglecting of marketing and PR and public opinion. Instead of wanting less spin, Obama now spoke of the need for more spin and better spin. But this too was spin, at least since Ben Tillman, and assuredly since long before, defeated politicians have always taken refuge in the false reassurance that they lost the political battle, not on the merits, but only in the more superficial, grubby, and disreputable realm of communication. In truth, good spin may help build support for a policy or candidate, but its powers are consistently overrated. Obama's poll numbers sagged for most of his presidency, not because of bad spin, but because of the wheezing U.S. economy and the chaos around the globe. The political consultant Paul Begala has said, the Titanic did not have a communications problem. The Titanic had an iceberg problem. Now, with his ambivalence towards spin, Obama isn't so unusual. On the surface, like the Obama of 2008, many of us, most of us, are Platonists, deploring the dark arts of the spin doctors. But deep down, even unwittingly, I think, we're Aristotelians. Like the Obama of 2010, we're ready to embrace spin if it serves what we consider to be worthy ends. In fact, when spin is deployed in the service of causes or candidates we believe in, we don't always recognize or identify it as spin. Which brings us to 2016. Today, people want to attribute Donald Trump's fireball candidacy to his success with spin. Maybe for the same reason Tillman ascribed TR's popularity to co-opting the media. Fundamentally, though, Trump's rise has more to do with deep ideological divisions in the country about race, immigration, globalization, economic dislocation than it does with the media. Still, there is some truth in the claim that Trump bulldozed through the primaries because he monopolized the TV airtime. And that was because many of us, including those of us who loathe him as well as those who love him, found the short-fingered vulgarian compelling to watch. I don't know if Trump is authentic, but I do think that Hillary Clinton was right in her convention speech when she said that the sad truth is, quote, there is no other Donald Trump. His unfiltered style, his penchant for saying what's ever on his mind, true or false, prudent or imprudent, propelled his standing, especially among those who are sick of the carefully calibrated locutions of candidates like, alas, Hillary Clinton. The thing is, if we're ambivalent about spin, we're also ambivalent about authenticity. Being unfiltered has its downside, as Donald Trump may have finally discovered. We should recall that once the Republican nomination was in his grasp or close, Trump began doing something he had never done before, walking back truly stupid and politically damaging statements, like saying women who have abortions should be punished or that America should default on its national debt. And while some voters may still cheer when Trump flouts political correctness, when he starts crowing about grabbing women's genitals, not so much. By contrast, most people haven't quite warmed to Clinton's dogged, careful Tracy Flick style, which leads to safe and bland, if perfectly sensible, positions on practically everything. Compare a Trump tweet to a Clinton tweet, the former unmistakably banged out by the candidate himself in an early morning fit of pique, the latter just as unmistakably sculpted by a squad of professional wordsmiths and public opinion experts exuding all the individuality and spontaneity of a press release. Yet also think about the first debate. One of Clinton's biggest applause lines, one of the best punches she landed, came when she said, "I think Donald just criticized me for preparing for this debate. And yes, I did. And you know what else I prepared for? I prepared to be president." Spin got its name in the 1980s from the post-debate volley and whirl of sound bites designed to shape the next day's messages, next day's coverage. And more on that maybe another time. But spin also includes the preparation that goes into presidential debates beforehand. That is a component of spin as well, from making sure you have a clean shave to weathering 90-minute rehearsals with a stand-in for your opponent. And so here, finally, we again see the dual nature of spin. When we watch the debates and suffer through the canned talking points, the lame one-liners, and the formulaic stories about the home health care worker and single mother with the opioid-addicted son who was thrown off her health insurance and had to choose between her child's occupational therapy and her mother's dialysis, we roll our eyes in despair that the spin doctors have too tight a grip on our political discourse. At times like these, like the Barack Obama of 2008, we wish there was less spin and more straight talk. And when we hear these candidate surrogates in the spin room reciting talking points about why their candidate won, talking points that the surrogates probably don't even believe and were quite possibly written before the debate began, we bemoan in a platonic temper spin's capacity for misleading. But when we see a well-prepared candidate in a smart suit coolly puncturing her opponent's falsehoods, lighting up our living rooms with a well-delivered barb, or distilling in well-crafted language why her rival should be kept far from the levers of power, at times like these, we may incline to take the Aristotelian position of Obama in 2010, wherein we recognize, with Theodore Roosevelt, with Hannah Arendt, that performance and artifice and message discipline and spin are a perfectly normal and legitimate part of politics, and, if used properly, can serve not only to mislead, but also, just as important, to lead. Thank you. So again, on questions, you can line up at that microphone for folks on that side of the room, and if you are on this side, I'll call on you and try to restate your question for my own microphone. You can, yeah. You can speak. I'll speak your question back. Very Trumpian of you. The backstage. Again, unvarnished, unmanaged. Right. So the question, right? Again, for the recording, is given the exposure through WikiLeaks and other technological developments, we see so much of candidates thinking and planning and strategizing, that it creates a certain cynicism or disillusionment, and isn't this dangerous to democracy? And yeah, I think there's a number of ways of thinking about it. I think part of what I try to argue in the book is that we have actually long been aware of this backstage dimension of politics. And while we have one mode that sort of disdains it and sees it as cynical and Machiavellian in the bad sense, we also in other moments can recognize that this is indeed necessary to politics. There's always a degree of cynicism or outrage even that kicks in with something like these WikiLeaks disclosures, where you see just how deliberately and strategically positions are adopted. But in a way, the big story of the WikiLeaks, I think, has been the lack of a story. I mean, there are, little squibs. Oh, look at this little tidbit. Well, they were right. They were trumped by the sex scandals, but at the same but I think as a result of the scandals, they got like the amount of attention that they deserved, rather than perhaps being overhyped in the lack of new news stories that they might have otherwise gotten. Because, probably the most damaging quote to come out of it was the one where Hillary Clinton says, well, sometimes you need a private position and a public position, which is, in a way, precisely what you're saying. But, her best defense of that should have been not to explain that she was talking about the movie Lincoln, which she actually was in the context, but to say, well, of course, when I go, as a diplomat, to negotiate with Putin, or if I go to Capitol Hill to negotiate with Republicans, we don't want that all broadcast on television in real time. You need a private space to back off your rigid position so that you can get things done. And I think people do understand that. Is this becoming more of a danger? I don't know. People said that at the time of the Nixon tapes, that the disclosure of his, Oval Office conversations was kind of dangerous. That this was his defense, even, that he needed executive privilege. But too much government secrecy isn't what I'm worried. Too little government secrecy isn't what I'm worried about right now. So, yes, back here. Mm-hmm.
That's particularly been, at least in the last 30 or 40 years, of the right and their sort of media machine, right? As we all know, when Fox News first came out, I don't know if they're still doing it, their whole slogan was fair and balanced, right? Because the whole idea was that the media's bias towards liberalism. And so inability to steal the concept that people have partisan agendas that might incorporate into their framing of things was, very much a political tool that was more useful for a long time. So they're right. If you can go all the way back to where you start your story with Teddy Roosevelt, right? His particular mastery of spin was not separate entirely, right? In many ways, very intertwined with his progressive agenda, right? He had styled himself as this guy who, cleaned up corruption in New York and was going to be able to do it because he was a cowboy and not like some fusty old McKinley dude, right? He would have like grabbed a gun out of his pants and shot himself, whatever. So I'm just wondering, like, it seems to me like the ideas about spin and bias are often, yeah, there is some sort of independent underlying anxiety there, but more often than not, they're just conduits and tools out of a political toolbox that people, both parties to a conflict, can use at any time considering the context. Right? Jimmy Carter, it was useful to play the authenticity after Nixon, but then the political situation could very well shift, and then bias and authenticity became sort of this territory that the new right was most successful. So where's the political sort of background or context?
Right. I mean, there very much is. I think you see throughout history, and I sort of had a line or two about this, how under FDR, the right wing gets all worked up about the danger of government propaganda, and liberals tend to think the fireside chats are so wonderful, where just 10 years earlier, it was all the liberal columnists who were bemoaning the propaganda of the Coolidge and Hoover administrations. So that, yeah, these whether you're giving propaganda, whether the media are biased, always reflects, something of a partisan. I wouldn't even say it's always a deliberate agenda, although there's something definitely deliberate in the right's strategic use of media bias in the last, 40-something years. But it's more, like I said, when it's in the service of causes we believe in, we don't even recognize it as spin. So, yeah, I mean, there's the political valence there, but I think it's still telling that there is an appeal to the fear of manipulation, which has resonances kind of across the board. And that's the language, that's the form that it takes, I think is significant. And I do think that the rise of this powerful presidency has kind of created White House spin, and then in turn the rise of this mass media has created media spin as these kind of bogeymen that we can, argue against, even when we really might feel the same thing just in conversation with our neighbors. Yeah, David. Right. So again, to repeat the question, isn't the complaint about spin not that, or not only that there's a fear of manipulation, but that there's a disappointment with the sort of low quality of our public discourse because it's so, I mean, you didn't say this quite, but shaped by these consultants and spin doctors, so that what politicians are saying doesn't rise to the kind of elevated political discussion that we think is worthy of our democracy. And I do think that's true. I do think that is there. And there are actually 2 or 3 different complaints with spin that get intermingled. One is the fear of manipulation. We kind of heard this a lot around the Iraq War, for example. And then that fades. And then there's also this one about, it's a little bit related to what you said, but I would say about authenticity, that there's a sense that the words and phrases that the candidates are saying, the politicians are saying, aren't their own, that it's kind of all phony baloney. And that's related. And I would just say that, well, this too goes way back. I mean, this is democracy, that, democracy has never been kind of, the Habermasian coffee shop discourse, that there's always been kind of pressures of catering to a wide audience. I mean, this is even, in Plato, and that the kind of pandering to the masses. Yes, I mean, it's not going to approximate the kind of discussion we might have in this room where, an intellectual history conference, it is instead the way democracy is practiced. And I think we should kind of get over our disappointment, or if not get over it, I mean, it's worth the effort to try to elevate it, but I don't think we should have illusions that there was or will be a time when democracy on a mass scale is going to be conducted in radically different terms. Over there at the microphone. Yeah.
Thanks. I enjoyed your talk, and speaking of preparation and spin, quote unquote, you've done a fine job of putting this together and summarizing your book. I feel a little bit like Bill Murray when he used to do movie reviews on Weekend Update, and he always would start by saying, "Now, I haven't seen the movie." And I feel that way about, I haven't read your book, but based on your presentation, it seems to me that it raises really a pretty fundamental question, not just about presidential politics or even politics, but if you define spin in the broad kind of way that you do when you trace it back to ancient Greece, to me it seems like fundamentally it's really making the point that when we express any idea, when we communicate with each other, there's a certain amount of spin going on. That is, we always speak from a perspective that ideas are rooted in material interest and conflict and so on. At least I would say they are, which raises a question about to what extent it's helpful to separate off presidential politics as reflecting spin as opposed to any kind of politics, any kind of human interaction. Now, I know when you write a book, you can't write the history of everything, but I wonder about that because spin has this negative kind of connotation. You did suggest in your talk that you can see it from two different angles, but getting back to the question about bias, I'm constantly battling with students about this, with the idea that there's this, to me, a false idea that there's unbiased information and then there's biased information. And I think there's this kind of empiricist prejudice that we're brought up with, especially here in this lovely country. And so we imagine that there's somehow spinless information available out there, which doesn't seem to be the case. And I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, when I first gave a early version of this talk, when I was still writing it, one colleague gave me the question, well, what presidential communication isn't spin under your definition? And, it was a hard question, it made me think. And then later, in another context, somebody said to me, remember when McCain, on the campaign trail, somebody yelled, Obama, he's an Arab, and, he's a Muslim, or something like that. And McCain, suddenly his better angels possessed him, and he said, no, madam, he's not. He's a decent American. He just believes differently from I do, and so on. And that seemed like an unspun moment. So, yeah, certainly there are moments where we say, oh, there was no, artifice there in politics, however rare that might be. There's also a distinction, I think, to be made in the realm of government communication and information, and I do try to develop this in the book somewhat, between those areas where we expect neutrality, and those where we don't. So, Walter Lippmann, we were talking about in the last panel, public opinion talks about the box scores and the close of the stock market and the weather as areas where we expect the newspaper to kind of give us unbiased information. But if we're arguing about, the temperament or character of a presidential candidate and what's appropriate to say and so on, that's never going to be free of inflection. And, bias is such a complicated term. I mean, I have students who will say, well, I'm biased, and what they really mean is I have an opinion. And sort of to separate out, bias from opinion, which is legitimate, and bias, which, I think we do want journalists and others in public discourse to be more attentive to, so it doesn't, compromise their arguments. But anyway, so a few responses.
Thank you.
There. Yeah. So the question is Gramsci right? And I happen to have Gramsci standing right here. I'm going to let him answer that question. Are sort of the tools of propaganda available only to those in power? I think one distinction that you see in Arendt and in a number of these other thinkers is that there really is a difference between an open society and, if not a totalitarian one in which the channels of communication are much more restricted. And I think, it's very easy for us to all complain that our viewpoint isn't represented in the media. But it actually usually is. And, I do think in a democracy, these questions have a very different valence from in a closed system where there is only state messaging. And, so a lot of the 1950s literature of Packard and Aldous Huxley sort of really blurs the distinctions between those kinds of systems. And I would say, for better or worse, kind of increasingly, there are more platforms and more opportunities. And in fact, when you see on Twitter and other social media kind of these alt-right or crazy left ideas surfacing, you think, oh, these ideas are new. And I rather think, no, they're not new. They just have been kind of somewhat kept out of the mainstream discourse, by the institutions of the mainstream media. So yes, of course, power gives a certain ability to restrict or open up what messages are heard. But it's hard for me to think of a time in American history when there haven't been a fair degree of competing messages. Congress fighting what the White House says, the Democrats fighting what the Republicans say, independent media of some voice criticizing both parties, that there's always been at least enough range of opinion and argument to make that a lesser worry, in my view. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
Yes, I really liked your Eric Hoffer quote, people can be made to believe only what they already know. So I'm wondering if you could use that to talk about the limits of spin. So
Right.
I'll give you one example. In the 2004 race, John Kerry was photographed duck hunting, and that was people believe that might have some effect on the white male, especially rural, though, which appears not to have had at all. So maybe that was an example of spin that failed. In your study, could you see a pattern of examples of spin that failed to accomplish its purposes? And then could you deduce from that some general principles about the limits of spin as to, okay, this sort of spin, this category, is in most cases not going to work? What can spin fail to accomplish? In what cases are people unpersuaded?
Right. There is, in the book I discuss a lot the limits of spin and even use that phrase and try to give any number of examples. One comes from Woodrow Wilson, who at first in his presidency was reluctant to go on these kind of speaking tours that Theodore Roosevelt had done so effectively, but does take it up, and he does one very effectively on behalf of preparedness and sort of building up the army for a war in case we have one, in the hope of not going to war. And he's actually, he's a terrific public speaker and he's very effective. And then, of course, for the League of Nations fight, he loses that magical ability. And, people saw this with Obama, too. There was sort of this great scratching of heads. How has this, man who was the silver-tongued orator, so moved us so much on the campaign trail in 2008, been so effective with communication, ineffective with communication in the early years of his presidency? And I would submit that it was things like the economy, that was these external realities, that he didn't lose his gift of eloquence or oratory. I tried hard, though, not to get too deep into this question of developing a generalizable rule of when spin is or isn't effective. I mean, there's this long tradition of what, in the communications field they call media effects. And ultimately, it seems to me have become a kind of sterile set of questions. I think its power is often overrated and overstated, but not zero. I mean, it's clear that messages can move us, and that messages that we are more susceptible to spin or propaganda or what have you, the less we know and the less we have the capacity to learn independently. So when we are relying on official sources to tell us there are or are not weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, we don't have as much capacity to investigate or find out otherwise. Although, when you look back at the media debates around going to war in Iraq, there was much more skepticism and dissent than the popular narrative would tell you. I mean, there were loads of columnists, there were reporters saying this aluminum tube stuff is nonsense. For anybody who wanted to be educated, you could develop a strong case for skepticism about going to war. But that said, it's sort of the amount of publicly, when there's great government secrecy or monopoly on the truth, and especially like in a totalitarian society, the capacity for persuasion is much greater. And when you have multiple channels of information available to the public, spin becomes that much harder to pull off. I'll say.
Oh, thanks. This is sort of a structural question, getting at this. I find as the older I get, the more of a monarchist I become, and I mean it this way. The American system is particularly fragile and personalized because, well, we don't have a president or a monarch and then the prime minister. So everything gets put on the persona of the president. So I wonder, and now of course I know in Great Britain, there are sex scandals and all sorts of stuff, but nevertheless it seems to me there's a kind of a safety valve when, say, Thatcher's replaced by Major. The policies are roughly the same, but the persona is gone, or more recently when Theresa May replaces Cameron. So, I mean, do you think that given the particular increasingly monarchical character of the American presidential system, that everything becomes sort of hyper pressurized? There's no way to within the middle of a term when a figure becomes radioactive to simply replace them with another figure who is then the same policies, and this accounts for the particular part of the nature of this. And I would say that it's with the rise of the power of the presidency that your narrative about spin kind of begins. I can't think about, I don't know, Chester Arthur or something in that way too. So I threw that out.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and I think it basically reflects a theme of the book, that is, with the rise of the presidency and the power of the presidency relative to Congress, this becomes a more urgent concern. And I think there are less direct but still effective mechanisms for restraint of presidential power. Not only impeachment, but when George Bush lost the Congress in 2006 and his poll numbers went down to 24% approval rating, he basically couldn't accomplish anything. He was restrained in that way. Congressional hearings and investigations, as we saw during the Clinton years, are a very powerful way of tying the president's hands when you have the Congress but not the presidency. So in some ways, I think, although we certainly have that powerful presidency that TR wanted to have and helped to usher in, it's not all that different in practice from British or other parliamentary systems. But certainly more and more of, and I discussed this with respect to TR, the president's power to persuade, to promote his agenda gets wrapped up in his image and persona. So, this is something that TR did very well, and he was the reformer, and that was, as this questioner said over here, sort of tied to his agenda. Sort of character and personality get sort of woven into the policy agenda, and that can be very powerful. Okay, just one. All right.
Okay, you touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could talk about how assumptions about a spin receiving public have changed. Because I asked this because the comparison with ancient Greece with Plato and Aristotle is interesting. But for me, where that really breaks down is that Plato's ideas are predicated on a very stratified concept of a public, right? And Aristotle also natural slavery. So I have to throw that back out.
Right, but so restate the first part of the question.
How attitudes about a spin receiving public have changed over time.
Right.
It seems like that's a very big part of the equation when we're thinking about it.
Right, right. So, I mean, to be clear, the book is not a history of spin since ancient Greece. It's since the start of the 20th century, basically, and dip in a little bit to the late 19th century to show, by way of contrast, the weaker presidency that existed then. So I don't sort of purport to kind of compare over societies and millennia, sort of different conceptions of the public, but I do think that one sees in the anxiety about spin and publicity propaganda throughout the 20th century an abiding concern that it is mass society in particular that is kind of providing, if not one of the key ingredients that make it so dangerous. In other words, if we had, like to go back to David's question, a smaller, educated, elite public that could discourse, maturely and intelligently about all questions of public affairs, then this concern would not be so great, whether it's a fear of manipulation or a fear of quality of discourse. So it's precisely that, public opinion really starts to get redefined, and I have a little section on Edward Ross, who some people in this room know far better than I do, but talking about what is public opinion, and in the earlier years with public opinion, there's a distinction made. I think it's which of the it's either Bryce or one of the British thinkers says public opinion is the opinion of the bald-headed men on the back of the omnibus, or the class that wears leather gloves, or they have these kind of evocative phrases to describe the elite public. And as American society transformed, you have more literacy. The franchise expands. Women are now included in the franchise. There's a sense that public opinion means something different, and there's efforts to separate out mass sentiment from public opinion. Edward Ross has a line that forgetting her name, sort of carrying sort of the temperance advocate, sort of destroying like the saloons. That's mass sentiment, Carrie Nation, but public opinion restrains her and her legions, so that public opinion is this kind of stabilizing, civilizing force. So there's these debates over really what public opinion even is or should be, and the fear with the mass society of the 20th century is that those stabilizing elements are no longer there. And I think, again, sort of, since the last question, to bring it back to Trump, like this, and I'm actually glad how few of the questions were about Trump. But this is sort of what we see in the anxiety about Trump and like the deplorables stuff, is that there are these sort of forces in our mass democracy that can't be stopped if the demagogue or the manipulator, with the certain kind of messaging is too skilled at it. So I think it very much taps into these questions of who is the public and what kind of authority the public has. Okay, well, thank you all very much.